Hey everyone, let's start with the medieval kings and queens who ruled their kingdoms during the day and floated peacefully through other worlds at night. Before you get too comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Please leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always interesting to see who is coming from all over the world. Now, turn down the lights. Maybe turn on a fan to make a soft background noise, and let's get used to the trip we take together tonight. You probably think of Queen Isabella of Castile as a strong, unyielding political force when you hear her name. She brought Spain together, paid for a confused Italian sailor who thought he had reached Asia, and scared Europe into submission. Isabella ruled over another kingdom, even though she was strict and religious. Her own pharmacy, which would shock a 21st century wellness influencer to death. It was hard to be queen. You had crusades to do, coordinate, nobles to threaten, treaties to sign, and at least 5 people a day trying to kill you before lunch. So Isabella did what any stressed out queen in the 15th century would do. She opened her herbal cabinet, which was full of medieval medicine that worked too well and probably broke drug laws in 17 different countries. For example, insomnia. You would drink chamomile tea today. She got opium tea, Isabella. Not a soft blend for bedtime, but a sleeping draught so strong that it could put a warrior into a coma. Isabella's doctors gave her cannabis-infused bombs before a diplomatic meeting because they thought that was the best way to deal with international relations when your shoulders were melting into the throne. Mandre root was the real star of her medical lineup, though. People in the Middle Ages thought that Mandre screamed when it was pulled out of the ground. Great sign. Could cure any illness, even the worst one, and could calm down even the most nervous king. Isabella drank Mandre. Preparations the way people today drink lattes every day without much fear of seeing an angel in the corner of the room. And then there was henbane. Henbane was thought to calm the mind. It really relaxed you so much that your mind left for a short time. But doctors said it made judgment clearer. Of course, nothing makes political decisions clearer than a mild medieval out-of-body experience. Imagining Isabella, the queen who sat in her room after a long day, holding her cup of medicinal opium, and thought, maybe I can run an empire and go to heaven at the same time. The best part was that all of this was perfectly normal. Your Majesty, maybe this is too strong, no one said. No, they said, this will balance your humors. This was medieval medical slang for, we have no idea what we're doing, but this stuff knocks people out beautifully. So, yes, Isabella conquered kingdoms, went on voyages, and changed the shape of continents, all while sometimes floating a few inches above her throne on the strongest herbal drinks that medieval science could legally mix. If there had been a most likely to drink something he shouldn't contest in medieval Europe, King Charles the Bad of Navarre would have won by a long shot. He probably would have accepted the trophy while high on something his court alchemists made. Charles didn't get the nickname the Bad because he was bad. He received it because he made choices that were all over the place, from dangerously impulsive to, "Sir, please step away from the potion." His plans for politics were all over the place. His alliances were hard to predict, and his routine for staying healthy was all over the place. An experiment in medieval chemistry that went horribly or hilariously wrong. Other kings relied on faith, discipline, or good advisors. Charles, on the other hand, relied on alchemy, which was like science in the Middle Ages, but with much bigger personality problems. His personal alchemists made potions that promised everything: more intense, intelligence, a better mood, spiritual clarity, political courage, and on one memorable occasion, immortality. These mixtures had great things in them, like opium, hashish, plants that made people see things, rare resins that had traveled farther than most peasants ever would, and powders that no one should have inhaled unless they wanted to die or get a crown. Charles didn't drink these potions carefully. No, he drank them with the same excitement as a college student who had just found out about energy drinks. The results were impressive and sometimes disastrous. One potion made him so happy that he tried to make peace with a tapestry. Another made him see things that he thought were messages from God. His advisors nodded politely, wrote down what he said, and tried not to freak out when the king started talking about conversations he had with made-up diplomats. His court doctors, bless their hopeful hearts, said that these herbal mixes would help balance his moods. Instead, they threw everything off balance: his feelings, his sleep, his choices, and maybe even his whole kingdom. But Charles kept drinking them because he didn't think these drinks were fun. They were tools for strategy. He would go to war if a potion made him brave. He would say that the rulers of nearby countries were plotting against him if a potion made him paranoid. If a potion made him feel like he was the most important person in the universe, he would announce big changes that no one understood. Eventually, even diplomats from other countries learned the signs. If Charles said hello to them in a calm way, he hadn't been to the alchemy lab yet. If he greeted them while sweating, shaking, or quoting prophecy, they knew that the talks were about to get very strange. So, yes, Charles the Bad was more than just a king. He was the most dedicated potion taster in medieval Europe. He pushed the limits of alchemical medicine with brave or foolish enthusiasm in a world without warning labels. Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II was also the King of Sicily, a crusader, a philosopher, a falcon lover, and a genius who spoke many languages. In short, the medieval version of a walking Wikipedia page also had a less well-known hobby: trying out any herbal or chemical substance that his scholars said would make him smarter. In medieval science, that meant anything. Frederick had scholars from all over Europe and the Islamic world around him. These men studied astronomy, math, medicine, and most importantly, experimental drugs. These doctors carried jars full of powders, tinctures, scented oils, resins, and dried plants that looked like the list of things you need for an old rave. But Frederick was curious, and that was a bad thing. When other kings asked, "Is this safe?" Frederick asked, "What will happen if I take two?" His scholarly advisors, who should have known better, encouraged this curiosity. They honestly thought that these mixtures helped people understand more. In practice, they made it possible to talk to falcons, see angels in strange clothes, and see whole. Nights spent talking about philosophy with people who had definitely left the room. Frederick liked aromatic resins and herbal vapors the best. Arab doctors used these during surgery and meditation. These fumes made people feel calm and clear, and if they breathed them in for long enough, they felt like the imperial ceiling had started to breathe. Frederick would sit in these rooms that smelled good and were full of haze, thinking about law, science, religion, and why his hands looked so interesting. The Pope once called him the Antichrist. He probably smelled the incense cloud coming from Frederick's tent and thought, that man is seeing God in ways we did not allow. Frederick also tried hashish preparations that scholars brought him and said they helped him focus. And to be fair, it did, at least until Frederick got so lost in thought about metaphysics that he forgot about the whole council meeting while sitting in the same room. The best part was that Frederick did tests on his, how each substance affects me. He wrote down changes in his mood, effects, feelings, and even philosophical thoughts. It was like writing in a journal in the Middle Ages. Every entry probably started with, "Today I learned that time is fake." His court learned to adapt. If Frederick floated into a room with a smile and cosmic calmness, they knew not to bring up taxes. If he stormed in quoting Aristotle, they knew he'd tried a stimulant. If he wandered in slowly petting a falcon and muttering about the nature of existence, well, that was. It was just a regular Wednesday. Frederick was brilliant, strange, unpredictable, and sometimes very, very high. If medieval courts had Yelp reviews, the Byzantine palace would have 5 stars for ambiance, lighting, and absolutely overwhelming incense usage. And no one embraced this aromatic lifestyle more enthusiastically than Empress Theodora, a woman who ruled an empire, survived palace intrigue, and inhaled enough perfumed fumes to accidentally astral project during morning prayer. In Byzantium, incense wasn't a small, it was a cultural obsession, almost like its own branch of government. Palaces, churches, hallways, and throne rooms were all filled with clouds of scented smoke, which were like the empire's version of mood lighting. Theodora loved these rituals. They were beautiful, sacred, and sometimes so strong that they made you forget your own name. The fumes were blue lotus resin, a known psychoactive, and opium gum, which is used to enhance contemplation. Cannabis oils were burned as part of purification rites, and incense from Persia and Egypt was so strong that priests had to open windows or risk floating out of their bodies during liturgy. Theodora didn't inhale all of this on purpose to get high. It was just everywhere. It was like breathing in the palace. But when the air quality in the palace was like scented soup, the effects were guaranteed. Picture Theodora sitting on her throne, receiving ambassadors from foreign lands. They enter the hall, eyes watering, noses overwhelmed, trying not to cough, while a fog of psychoactive aromatics fills the air like a mystical smoke machine. Meanwhile, Theodora, who was used to this every day, sits perfectly still on the throne, giving off an aura of divine enlightenment. The ambassadors probably thought Byzantine emperors literally levitated. Her advisors often said that Theodora entered states of heightened spiritual perception. Translation: the incense was working overtime, and court ceremonies were even stronger. Some rituals burned so many psychoactive resins that choir boys got dizzy, and monks saw halos around everything, even the furniture. Theodora participated with regal composure, occasionally receiving visions or prophetic insight. Whether these insights came from God, genius, or the vapors is still an open scholarly debate. In private, her bathhouse rituals involved herbal steam infused with narcotic flowers that relaxed the muscles, eased stress, and probably made the palace walls breathe slightly if you stared too long. So, yes, Theodora ruled an empire with sharp political instincts and fierce intelligence, but she also spent years breathing an incense haze so thick it could double as medieval anesthesia. If anyone in medieval Europe deserved an award for most unexpected ways to get high, King Philip the Fair of France would absolutely receive it, and he'd accept it inside a cathedral surrounded by priests waving incense burners the size of medieval kettles. Philip the Fair was famous for many things. According to every historian who ever wrote about him, he bankrupted the Knights Templar, fought with the Pope, and was unreasonably attractive. But what people forget is that Philip spent a lot of time in church. And these weren't quiet, calm church services. These were full medieval liturgical extravaganzas where the incense wasn't just there, it was impossible to miss. Medieval church incense was nothing like the gentle sandalwood you find in modern yoga studios. Oh no, this was a powerful mix of frankincense, myrrh, psychoactive tree resins from the Middle East, benzone, thorax, and sometimes herbs that encourage divine visions, which is a polite way of saying, sit too close and you will absolutely start seeing angels tap dancing on the altar. And King Philip didn't sit in the back row. Philip sat front and center, directly under the incense clouds, for hours. Imagine the scene: a grand cathedral filled with chanting monks, sunlight pouring through, mix of frankincense, myrrh, psychoactive tree resins from the Middle East, benzone, thorax, and sometimes herbs that make you see divine visions. This is a polite way of saying, if you sit too close, you'll definitely start seeing angels tap dancing on the altar. And King Philip didn't sit in the back row. Philip sat front and center, right under the incense clouds for hours. Imagine the scene: a grand cathedral filled with chanting monks and sunlight pouring through, stained glass, and plumes of thick incense swirling dramatically around Philip's head like he's the main character in a medieval music video. While everyone else is quietly praying, Philip is inhaling enough aromatic resin to communicate with the Holy Spirit in surround sound. Priests insisted the purpose was spiritual elevation. Philip took that very seriously, sometimes a little too seriously. Chroniclers describe Philip as deeply contemplative during Mass, often entering states of intense focus, staring fixedly at a single point on the wall as if decoding heaven's Wi Fi password. Some diplomats claimed he occasionally emerged from ceremonies glowing with inspiration. Others said he emerged glazed over and smiling mysteriously, which, as historians speak for medieval incense, hit him like a truck, and he attended Mass constantly, not once a week, but daily, sometimes multiple times a day, which means Philip spent a significant portion of his royal life in a haze of sacred fumes, potent enough to tranquilize a camel. Did he enjoy it? Absolutely. Did it influence his judgment? Let's just say outlawing the Templars and arresting a pope were very bold moves, and perhaps not the kind one makes completely sober. So, yes, Philip the Fair ruled France with strategic brilliance, political ruthlessness, and a respiratory system perpetually filled with holy smoke. Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine was many things: political mastermind, cultural icon, mother of kings, and the undisputed queen of making medieval men. Extremely nervous, but there's one part of Eleanor's life that rarely gets mentioned: her love of wine, and not just any wine, medieval wine, enhanced wine, wine fortified with more herbs than a witch's pantry. See, medieval wine wasn't the delicate stuff you swirl gently while discussing philosophy. Medieval wine was basically grape juice with commitment issues. It was strong, unpredictable, and often improved with herbal additives designed to boost mood, stimulate creativity, or knock you out. Cold, depending on the blend. Eleanor lived in Aquitaine, the wine capital of medieval Europe, where everyone had strong opinions about vintages, barrels, and grapes. The court poets were only as good as their nearest bottle. Court records say that Eleanor hosted feasts where the wine flowed freely and came mixed with delightful additions like wormwood, which made the mind wander into interesting and sometimes scary places. Hip and rosemary, which lifted the spirits, and poppy syrup, which guaranteed you would sleep like a blessed corpse afterward. Cannabis seeds steeped in wine to encourage poetic invention, a medieval phrase meaning you will absolutely write something dramatic tonight. It wasn't recreational, it was courtly culture, a sophisticated excuse, really. Imagine a court poet nervously performing for Eleanor. She sits with her golden hair braided into a crown, sipping a goblet of herb-infused Aquitanian wine that could knock the armor off a Templar, nodding slowly as she evaluates whether the poem is brilliant or if she just can't feel her face anymore. And the troubadours loved it. They said Eleanor's wine unlocked inspiration, which is medieval code for we drank something and started rhyming uncontrollably. Entire poetic movements were born because someone poured too much wormwood into the barrel, but Eleanor wasn't using these drinks to escape reality. She was using them to plan. A relaxed court is easier to control, and a court that is creatively inspired makes better propaganda. It's much easier to win arguments with a diplomat. And let's be honest, if you had married King Henry II, you would probably need a drink too. Eleanor's stronger wine wasn't a weakness. It was a political tool, a cultural signature, and sometimes a spiritual journey. And through it all, she remained one of the most powerful and sharp-minded rulers of the medieval age, even if her wine sometimes had the kick of a small dragon. King Louis IX, later known as Saint Louis, was known for being pious, disciplined, noble, charitable, and sometimes so spiritually high that people wondered if he was talking to angels or just taking too many medieval medicinal herbs. Spoiler alert, probably both. Louis took religion very, very seriously, to the point of being sick. If holiness were a sport, Louis would have won by such a large margin that the Pope would have to start drug testing. But medieval sainthood didn't just come from giving to the poor and going on crusades. It also came from making medicinal potions, made by court doctors who thought the best way to help was to give people sedatives. When Louis was stressed, which was often because ruling France in the 13th century was like being in a never-ending group project, his doctors gave him spiritual calming treatments. In other words, medieval herbal potions that were strong enough to make a statue blink. Louis's medical lineup included poppy-based syrups that monks called sleeping cordial, but that modern doctors would call, please do not. Do not operate heavy machinery after drinking this. Valerian infusions were meant to calm the mind, but they could also calm your ambition, personality, and probably a small village. Henbane extracts opened the mind to spiritual truths, usually right before closing the mind to basic motor skills. Myrrh and resin vapors burned during devotions thick enough to make the chapel look like a medieval rock concert. The result? Louis often fell into deep, contemplative trances that his advisors sometimes had to wake him up from, had to wave their hands in front of his face to see if he was having a divine revelation or just really relaxed. Chroniclers, who were too polite to call their future saint medicated, instead called these times of severe devotion, which is medieval historian code for the incense did something. His intense prayer sessions often lasted for hours. He knelt still, eyes half closed, surrounded by clouds of resin smoke, whispering prayers, visions, or maybe even recipe ideas. No one could hear him. Clearly over the incense burners, hissing like medieval humidifiers. Foreign diplomats who attended these ceremonies reported feelings of euphoria, lightness, and holy dizziness. One ambassador admitted he forgot why he had come and simply joined Louis in prayer. The incense absolutely worked. But here's the twist. Louis's judgment remained sharp. His administrative decisions were famously fair, his justice system admired, and his reforms lasting. So either the herbs sharpened his saintly instincts, or he was the only person in history to run a country while high on drugs and still do it better than his sober competitors. In the end, Louis didn't get high for fun. He got high for God, which was the most respectable reason in medieval Europe. Emperor Basil I started out as a stable boy and rose to power through charm, talent, and a very suspicious series of promotions. He eventually ruled the Byzantine Empire with the confidence of a man who absolutely believed God was on his side. And to be fair, Basil often felt divine thanks to one of the empire's most popular psychoactive imports, blue lotus. Blue lotus, a fragrant Egyptian flower, had been used in rituals, medicine, and high society events for centuries. Historians call it the ancient world's favorite mild hallucinogen. Basil loved it, not because he wanted to party, but because the palace was full of it. Incense braziers, bathhouse, perfumed oils, and ceremonial garlands were all around. The Blue Lotus was everywhere, turning Basil's daily routine into a pleasantly floaty sensory experience. Imagine waking up as emperor. You step into your bath, Blue Lotus steam. You walk through the palace, Blue Lotus incense. You sit on your throne, attendants waving fans dipped in Blue Lotus oil. By lunchtime, Basil wasn't just emperor. He was gently levitating emotionally, spiritually, and probably politically. Chroniclers say Basil had a serene composure and a calm authority. Of course he did. It's easy to stay calm. The air around you smells like an old spa, and your brain is getting soft floral whispers of shh, don't worry about the taxes. Foreign ambassadors who visited Basil's court often noted the ethereal atmosphere, a polite way of saying that the throne room looked like a fog machine set to maximum. Some envoys left meetings so relaxed that they forgot to deliver half of their diplomatic messages. One Venetian diplomat wrote that meeting Basil felt like meeting a god in a cloud of perfume. The fumes hit him harder than he thought they would. Did Basil want these effects? It's hard to say. Blue Lotus was a part of Byzantine culture, especially among the rich. In bathhouse, the heated air mixed with lotus oil made a dreamy haze that was perfect for talking about politics, philosophy, or which general should be fired next. But Basil definitely liked the look of it. He ordered perfumes, reordered ceremonial incense blends, and reportedly preferred halls that smelled like lotus to normal air. Because why breathe? Why breathe boring oxygen when you can breathe something with personality? The best part is that Basil was a surprisingly good ruler. He reorganized the finances, strengthened the army, and started a dynasty, all while living in a fragrant, mildly psychoactive botanical cloud. So yes, Basil was not only the founder of the Macedonian dynasty, he was also Byzantium's most elegantly relaxed emperor. King Richard the Lion-He Heart is remembered as a crusading hero, a military genius, and a man whose preferred way of communicating was loud sword noises, and someone who spent about 3 days of his entire reign in England. People forget that Richard's life was a never-ending stream of injuries, and medieval medicine treated those injuries as if they were a brick through a window. Richard fought all the time: siege warfare, skirmishes, duels, battles, and tournaments. If violence were a loyalty program, Richard would have reached platinum status in a week. Naturally, he got hurt like a medieval. Hobby: arrows, swords, lances, friendly fire, unfriendly fire, you name it, he got hit by it. And because medieval medicine had not yet discovered anesthesia stronger than bite this stick, Richard's doctors relied heavily on opium-based treatments. And when I say based, I mean almost entirely opium. After battles, Richard's medical tent resembled a medieval spa run by someone who had heard about modern pharmacology only through vague rumors. Physicians prepared syrups, picuses, salves, and drinks with so much opium that Richard probably achieved spiritual enlightenment several times without meaning to. Imagine the scene. Richard lies on a table, bleeding, annoyed, and refusing to stop giving tactical orders. A physician approaches with a cup. "Drink this, sire. It will ease the pain." Richard, "Does it also make me invincible?" Physician, "Probably not, but you won't care anymore." Even during long sieges, Richard's pain treatments included poppy wine, essentially medieval NyQuil with. Richard drank so much opium that he probably had spiritual enlightenment several times without meaning to. Picture this. Richard is lying on a table, bleeding, angry, and refusing to stop giving tactical orders. A doctor comes up with a cup and says, "Drink this, sire. It will ease the pain." Richard asks, "Does it also make me invincible?" The doctor says, "Probably not, but you won't care anymore." Even during long sieges, Richard's pain treatments included poppy wine, which was basically medieval NyQuil with. Delusions of grandeur. Soldiers said that after taking his medicine, the king would sit up straight, calm, and vaguely glowing, giving brilliant military advice, or sometimes reciting poetry at the wall. His most famous injury happened in 1199 when a crossbow bolt hit him in the shoulder. Medieval surgery followed, which involved heated metal tools, prayers, screaming, and blessedly opiate sedation. Richard reportedly stayed shockingly calm throughout the procedure. Proof that either he was superhuman or the opium dose was strong enough to calm a cavalry horse. But through all of this, Richard's leadership stayed sharp. He negotiated truces in the middle of a siege, led armies with terrifying charisma, and scared enemies, even though he was bandaged like a medieval scarecrow. In reality, Richard didn't use these drugs for fun. He used them because medieval warfare was basically a full-time job to destroy your skeleton. But thanks to medieval medicine's strongest herbal offerings, the lion, he heart marched, fought, ruled, and occasionally floated. Queen Joanna of Castile, better known by the unfortunate nickname Joanna the Mad, has long been portrayed as emotionally unstable, dramatic, hysterical, or simply too much for the men who wrote her biographies. But the truth is far less insulting and far more medieval. Her court physicians kept giving her medicinal cocktails so potent they could tranquilize a choir. Joanna lived under enormous political pressure. Her husband betrayed her. Her father manipulated her son imprisoned her, and half of Europe whispered behind her back like a medieval reality TV cast. So her doctors decided the best way to help her relax was to chemically launch her into orbit. They gave her opium syrups to calm her down, which was like saying "Good night, Your Majesty." They also gave her cannabis oils to put on her skin or under her tongue to calm her down. Both calmness and the philosophical realization that the floor had interesting textures. Nightshade microdoses, the medieval equivalent of asking, "What if we accidentally poison the queen, but in a helpful way?" Even better, Joanna rarely had a say in any of this. If she cried, they gave her a sedative. If she argued, they handed her another draft. If she tried to explain complex political thoughts, some court doctor nodded softly and said, "Yes, yes, drink this." And Joanna, smart, articulate, and exhausted, usually cooperated. Chroniclers later described her as unstable. But let's be honest. If you spent decades being force fed medieval anxiety medication, locked away from your children, and surrounded by political vultures, you wouldn't be walking around like a serene Disney princess either. Imagine her daily life. Joanna sits near her window, frustrated with her circumstances. A physician scurries over, holding yet another potion. "Your Majesty, it will calm your nerves, Joanna. My nerves are." "Fine. I need constitutional authority." Physician: "Yes, yes. Drink the potion." Within minutes, Joanna is calmer, not happier, not healthier, but calmer because the mixture she drank is roughly equivalent to being tackled by a very polite elephant. And the tragedy, the more sedated she became, the more men around her claimed she was unfit to rule. Joanna wasn't mad. She was medicated into oblivion by a court that benefited from her silence. So yes, she lived part of her life in a soft cloud of medicinal haze, not. King Henry IV of England had one big problem. He couldn't sleep. And not just because he stayed up too late, doom scrolling. This was medieval kingdom crushing insomnia, the kind where a king stares at the ceiling for 8 hours, thinking about rebellions, unpaid soldiers, and whether God is mad at him personally. Luckily or unluckily, Henry's doctors were determined to help, and medieval doctors thought that when. You can't rest your mind, so you have to use drugs so strong they could knock down a cathedral to get it to rest. So Henry was given a rotating menu of medieval sleeping aids, including poppy milk, a thick white opiate mixture that monks said was a blessing, and modern pharmacists would say, "Please absolutely do not drink this." Mandre wine, which is made from a root that is said to scream when dug up, is always a good sign for medicinal safety. Henbane's sleeping draughts can make you feel calm. Dreams, crazy dreams, or sometimes no dreams at all because you went straight to sleep. Valerian and lavender steeped ale for nights when they pretended to be nice. Imagine being Henry. It's midnight. Your kingdom is on fire, both metaphorically and literally, and the royal doctor walks in with a cup that smells like a wizard's compost heap. "Drink this, sire. It will make your problems go away, Henry." Will it, doctor? I don't know, but you will definitely stop complaining. And the potions worked. Chroniclers said that Henry often fell asleep at awkward times, like during council meetings, mass, and once during a fight about taxes, which might have been on purpose. But these weren't peaceful, calm naps. Medieval sedatives get hit like a trebuchet. Henry would go from wide awake to horizontal in seconds, only to wake up groggy, confused, and vaguely glowing from the herbal residue. His sleep problems only got worse as he got older. Stress, illness, and Henry IV was a competent, strategic, and stubbornly effective ruler, but he was also prone to insomnia, which made him volatile and irritable. He spent a lot of his reign on medicated potions. Each new rebellion meant a new dose, and each new political disaster meant a stronger mixture. His doctors responded to national crises by stirring potions faster, drifting between exhaustion and potion-induced unconsciousness. A king ruling England on the medieval equivalent of prescription sleep grenades. Queen Catherine de Valois, mother of the Tudor dynasty and accidental founder of half of England's future royal drama, had one consistent approach to stress management: fumigation therapy, and not the gentle eucalyptus mist you find in modern spas. No, Catherine enjoyed the medieval version, which was essentially sitting in a small heated room being slow cooked in psychoactive vapor. Fumigation chambers were popular among the medieval elite. They were meant to cleanse the body, calm the spirit, and soften emotional imbalances. In practice, they functioned like herbal hot boxes designed by someone who had never heard the phrase ventilation. Catherine's chambers burned cannabis resin, opium-infused oils, henbane smoke, and various mysterious royal herbs that physicians swore were medicinal, even though none of them could explain why everyone left the room. Walking into door frames. Imagine Catherine walking into the room after a long diplomatic disaster. She sits down like a queen, ready to relax. The attendants close the door, which is tighter than a medieval tax collector's purse. Then they light the herbal mixture. Slowly, the room fills with thick, fragrant smoke that makes you wonder if the walls are melting or if your problems are just gone. Within minutes, Catherine feels better, which is medieval. Medical language for your majesty. You probably won't feel anything for at least 2 hours. Her doctors wrote lovingly about how the fumes loosened the humors, relaxed the womb, and freed the mind from sorrow. In modern terms, we invented aromatherapy, but accidentally made it a drug. Court attendants sometimes had to escort Catherine out because she stayed too long and started talking to the furniture. One chronicler politely noted that after fumigation sessions, the queen spoke with great gentleness and contemplation, which is a very diplomatic way of saying she was absolutely floating. Even ambassadors noticed. One Burgundian envoy described Catherine's presence as serene, luminous, and slightly unsteady. Another wrote that speaking with her felt like conversing through a warm cloud. These men weren't poets. They just survived secondhand exposure. But the most entertaining detail, fumigation was prescribed for romantic vitality. Yes, that kind. And considering Catherine famously married Owen Tutor in secret, then launched a new royal, some people might say that the fumes worked a little too well. So, even though Catherine de Valois ruled with grace and left behind a dynasty, a lot of her emotional stability came from sitting calmly in a room filled with enough herbal smoke to calm the Archbishop of Canterbury. King Alonso X of Castile, who is known to history as Alonso the Wise, got his nickname not because he acted wisely, but because he surrounded himself with scholars, astrologers, translators, poets, magicians, and anyone else who could help him, who could teach him something. Whether that something was astronomy or how to brew a trance-inducing herbal tea in the palace basement. Alonso believed that knowledge came from 3 places: books, the heavens, and drinking whatever his court philosophers handed him. And since medieval scholars were fond of experimenting with consciousness, altering herbs for research, Alonso became the lucky royal volunteer for half of Iberia's intellectual science projects. His court brewed concoctions made from mugwort used by astrologers to open the mind to the stars or to make you think constellations are winking at you. Mondre microdoses because Alonso believed it unlocked mathematical clarity. Blue lotus and cannabis teas, popular among Andalusian scholars for inducing meditative states. Myrrh and cinnamon infusions, which were supposed to stabilize the humors, but mostly stabilized Alonso into not standing up for a while. If you walked into Alfonso's palace on a typical evening, you'd find a group of scholars sitting cross-legged on cushions, passing around. Alfonso took detailed notes like a man preparing for an exam assigned by God. He wasn't getting high for fun. He was getting high for research. Imagine him listening to a scholar describe a new herbal blend. Your Majesty, this one encourages astral insight. Alonso, at last something that might help me rewrite the legal code. And he did rewrite the legal code. Spain's most important medieval law book, the Siete Partidas, was written during this time of mystical scholarship. Some of those laws are so philosophical that you can absolutely tell someone was sipping something herbal while drafting them. Alonso also studied astrology with such devotion that he held nighttime sessions under the stars, often after drinking vision wine, a mixture strong enough to make anyone think they understood planetary motion. And honestly, his astronomical tables were shockingly accurate, proof that either the herbs worked or medieval Spain ran on pure chaotic genius. Foreign visitors described Alonso as deeply contemplative, intensely focused, and occasionally lost in thought for long intervals. Translation: the king tried another experimenta tea and is now communicating with Jupiter. But here's the thing, Alfonso was brilliant. He wrote poetry, commissioned translations, advanced science, unified legal systems, and preserved ancient wisdom. He just happened to do it while occasionally hovering at the outer edge of consciousness. Empress Irene of Byzantium was many things. Shrewd politician, occasional, usurper, enthusiastic blinder of rivals. But she was also a woman who spent so much time surrounded by incense that her entire reign might as well have taken place inside a perfumed fog bank. If you've ever walked past an overly enthusiastic incense booth at a festival, imagine that. But make it imperial policy. Byzantine religious and political life revolved around ceremonial incense, and Irene took those ceremonies seriously, very seriously. Her court burned mountains of the stuff: frankincense from Arabia, myrrh from Ethiopia, thorax, benzone, resin from faraway mountains, and herbs known for their vision-enhancing effects, depending on the ritual. In the 9th century, vision-enhancing meant, Your Majesty, you may see God or something that looks like him. When ambassadors came to see her, Irene made sure they were met with a thick haze of fragrant smoke that could hide an entire infantry unit. Diplomats walked into her throne room, blinking, coughing politely, and trying not to trip over furniture they could no longer see. See, Meanwhile, Irene sat perfectly poised in the center of this aromatic hurricane, like a serene, slightly glowing deity. Chroniclers describe her as radiant, spiritually elevated, and calm beyond earthly worry. Yes, that's what happens when you spend your days marinating in incense, capable of numbing half the nervous system. She probably handled political stress the same way a spa client handles hot stones, with quiet resignation and mild hallucination. Her private chapel was even more intense. Irene loved long prayer sessions with chanting monks, candlelight, and incense burners that didn't just waft. They erupted fumes like volcanoes that were meant to bless you. Priests swung censers in wide arcs, filling the room until theology became a full body experience. One monk wrote that Irene's prayers were accompanied by visions. Based on how much resin they were burning, those visions could have included angels, saints, or possibly a talking mosaic on the wall. Whatever she. It must have been inspiring for Irene to make some bold political decisions afterward, like blinding her own son to keep power. Let's just say that incense alone can't be blamed, but it definitely helped her sense of dramatic timing. Her bath rituals were just as fragrant. Heated rooms filled with medicinal herbs created a steam so strong that attendants sometimes needed breaks to avoid walking sideways afterward. So, yes, Empress Irene ruled an empire with cunning faith, and she ruled with unyielding imperial authority. She also ruled from inside a cloud of incense so strong that it could make a basilica float. Few medieval rulers had the tragic, chaotic, and medically imbued reputation of King Charles V of France, who was also known by the very subtle nickname Charles the Mad. But here's the twist. Much of his infamous instability came not just from illness, but from the heroic amounts of medicinal substances his court physicians kept pouring into him like medieval bartenders who skipped the part. Charles's reign started off pretty well. He was smart, charming, and capable, but then, while he was marching with his army, he had a sudden mental breakdown. One minute he was planning strategy, and the next he was attacking his own knights because he thought they were impostors sent to kill him. Medieval burnout was no joke. Of course, his doctors gave him their favorite treatment. Your Majesty, you need more herbs. And when medieval doctors said herbs, they didn't mean chamomile. Charles was given nightshade microdoses, which is already a red flag. No dosage of nightshade should be called micro in the 1300s. Henbane elixirs believed to calm storms of the mind, though they also caused mild paralysis and visionary episodes. Poppy syrups consumed as casually as tea. Cannabis resins burned in his chambers during episodes of agitation. Myrrh and resin vapors, because if it worked for priests, maybe it would work for France's most stressed out king. The intentions were noble. The results were mixed. Picture Charles pacing through the palace in the middle of an episode, convinced he was made of glass. Yes, he really believed this. While attendants tiptoed around him, carrying bowls of steaming herbal mixtures strong enough to stupefy a choir boy. There was even a rule in the palace. No one was allowed to touch him suddenly because he was afraid he would shatter. His servants walked around him like he was a very anxious chandelier. Now, add to this fragile mental state the fact that he was getting continuous doses of medieval sedatives that would make modern psychiatrists faint, and you have a king who drifted through reality like a balloon someone forgot to tie down. And yet Charles had lucid periods. During those rare windows, he expressed heartbreaking awareness of his condition. But the moment he showed distress, his doctors hurried forward with yet another potion that promised clarity and delivered something closer to, "Please lie down before you fall down." His illness was real, his suffering was immense, but the treatments often made things worse. By the end of his life, Charles VI wasn't ruling France. He was just floating through it, caught between madness, medicine, and a kingdom praying he wouldn't wander off barefoot into the courtyard again. And that closes our list. A king who lived in a haze, not entirely of his own making. Arminius' life began far from marble villas and marching legions. He was born among the Cherushi, a forest people whose world was made of rivers, oak groves, and warriors who believed that freedom was sacred enough to die for, but Rome had other ideas. In the late 1st century BCE, the empire was expanding into Germania, and peace often came with a contract signed in blood. Tribal princes were taken to Rome as hostages, not prisoners in chains. No, the Romans were far more elegant with their control. These children were insurance policies raised in the capital to ensure their tribes behaved. Arminius was one of them. Imagine being 8 years old and led away from your homeland, watching your mother disappear behind the trees as Roman cavalry took you south. You're not shackled, but you know you're not going home anytime soon. To the Romans, this wasn't cruelty, it was strategy. If the boy grew up Roman in taste, loyalty, and ambition, he would return as a collaborator, a German body, but a Roman mind. In Rome, Arminius learned Latin, philosophy, warfare, and the subtle art of being useful to an empire that considered his people univilized. He dined with aristocrats, studied under generals, and observed how power was created, commanded, and enforced. He wasn't treated like a barbarian. Ironically, he was treated too well. Rome made sure its hostages were comfortable, educated, and flattered, because comfort is the softest kind of chain. Still, even as he absorbed Roman tactics and etiquette, the contrast must have gnawed at him. Here he was, a young noble of the Cherushi, listening to Roman instructors mock the tribes of Germania as primitive brutes, the same tribes that had sent their children as hostages to avoid being wiped out, the same tribes that still whispered Arminius's name at winter feasts, not sure if he was even alive. By the time he became an adult, Arminius was no longer just a German prince. Rome had made him a knight of the equestrian order, a trained commander, loyal to the emperor in theory, fluent in Latin, disciplined in Roman military doctrine, and fully aware of how legions lived, marched, and died. Rome believed. Rome thought it had tamed him, but what it really did was teach Arminius how to destroy it. When he grew up, Rome thought of him as one of its own, or at least close enough to pass in uniform. The boy, who had been taken from the forests of Gerania, had become a polished officer of the Roman auxiliary forces, a knight in the equestrian order, and exactly the kind of foreign-born commander Rome loved to show off as proof of its civilizing mission. Arminius wore the Roman cloak, carried the Roman sword, and rode next to generals who thought he admired everything the empire stood for. And to be fair, Rome had given him real power. As a commander of auxiliary cavalry, Arminius fought in campaigns along the Danube, putting down rebellions and testing his skill against enemies who did not yet know his name. He learned how legions deployed across open fields, how Roman engineers fortified camps overnight, how officers relayed orders, and perhaps most important, how overconfident Roman commanders became when facing people they considered inferior. Every victory Rome gained taught Arminius something. Every battle honed his instincts. He even earned citizenship and the coveted equestrian rank from Emperor Augustus himself, a badge of honor Romans would have killed for. From the outside, Arminius looked like the poster child for assimilation, a barbarian turned Roman, a success story of imperial ideology. He could sit in Roman banquets, quote, Roman poets, and still command soldiers, without anyone questioning his loyalty. But Rome had made one mistake. They thought Arminius had forgotten where he came from. During his service, he heard whispers from the northern frontier about Rome tightening its grip on Germania, tribes being humiliated by corrupt governors, and lands being carved into provinces without asking the locals. Rome didn't see the tribes as allies. It saw them as unclaimed property. Taxation, forced disarmament, and puppet chieftains followed. To Augustus, Germania was just another prize to be taken. For Arminius, it was still home. So he began to live a double life. During the day, he rode with Roman officers, smiling and pretending to be loyal. At night, he thought about everything Rome had taught him, not as lessons to serve the empire, but as tools to break it. The irony was almost poetic. Rome's training had not Romanized Arminius, it had weaponized him. He was now a soldier who understood both worlds, the discipline of Rome and the fury of Germania. Soon, Rome would learn that this was the deadliest combination imaginable. When Arminius finally returned to Germania, he did not come as a wandering exile, but as a decorated Roman officer, the kind of man governors welcomed with open arms, expecting loyalty and obedience. Yet the moment his boots touched the forest soil of his homeland, he felt the divide between Rome's polished marble and the raw earth of the tribes. Germania was not a land that bowed easily. The rivers flowed the same, the oak groves whispered as they always had. But there was tension under the familiar landscape, sharp enough to taste. Rome had promised to be an ally, but what the tribes got was occupation. Publius Quintilius Varus, the Roman governor, saw his job as not as stewardship, but as domination. He imposed taxes, which tribes saw as a sign of wealth, not coins. And he enforced Roman law with an arrogance that was greater than his understanding of local customs. Courts, punishments, and demands for tribute spread like a rash, making things worse. Every chief, from the Weser to the Rhine, Rome might have thought it was bringing order, but to the Germans it felt like a slow suffocation. Arminius saw it right away. The chiefs who greeted him were proud, but also desperate. These were men who had once stood tall beside his father, but now they whispered their complaints in the shadows, afraid of Roman spies. They asked Arminius what he had seen in the capital. Was Rome truly unstoppable? Was resistance hopeless? His answers were careful, measured, never revealing the fire already building inside him. Varus, blind and complacent, admired Arminius. Here was a German who spoke perfect Latin, who had fought Rome's battles, who understood Roman discipline. In Varus's mind, Arminius was an asset, a bridge between cultures, someone who could help pacify the region. He had no idea that Arminius was studying him, not with loyalty, but with calculation, because Arminius knew what the Germans could not yet admit. Rome did not. Rome absorbed. Today it was taxes and courts. Tomorrow it would be disarmament, labor conscription, and hostages taken generation after generation. His people were on borrowed time. Germany needed a leader, not a diplomat, not a negotiator, a strategist, someone who understood Rome from the inside. And Arminius realized with a clarity that reshaped the course of history that he was the only man who could fill that role. Rome had returned him to his homeland. They had no idea he came carrying there. Doom. Arminius knew that revolutions don't start with yelling. They start with listening quietly and patiently until every complaint, insult, and wound caused by the occupying force shows a pattern. So he traveled from tribe to tribe, going to councils, drinking at feasts, and sitting next to chieftains who had become bitter under Roman rule. Some had sons conscripted into auxiliary forces, while others had lost land to Roman administrators. A few just hated the idea of answering, to men who wore skirts made of metal plates. But all shared one truth. The tribes of Germania had never been more united in their anger. The problem was fear. Rome looked invincible. 3 legions guarded the region, disciplined, armored, and led by Varus, a governor who may have been incompetent, but still commanded overwhelming military force. The tribes had fallen before Rome before. Why should this time be different? Arminius had the answer, because unlike any Germanic leader before him, he knew Rome's weaknesses, how legions marched, how they reacted under pressure, how supply lines could be broken, how commanders trusted maps more than their gut feelings, and most importantly, how overconfidence could blind even the most experienced Roman officer. He began to say the unthinkable. Rome could be beaten, not in open battle, which would be suicide, but in the forests where the trees closed in and cavalry became useless, in the mud where heavy armor turned soldiers into stumbling statues. In narrow passes where legions couldn't set up their perfect formations, Germania was not just home, it was a weapon. But a rebellion needed unity, and unity needed trust. So Arminius met secretly with leaders like Segum, his father, Malavendus of the Marsi, and chiefs from the Brooki and the Chatti. They made up the core of a coalition that Varus never thought existed. At councils lit by firelight, warriors leaned forward as Arminius laid out a plan that was so bold it felt like madness. Lure Varus deep into unfamiliar territory during a staged uprising, then destroy the Roman army piece by piece. Some chiefs hesitated. Betraying Rome was one thing. Executing a coordinated attack on 3 legions was another. But Arminius's confidence was contagious. His knowledge was precise. His conviction was unmistakable. And slowly, resistance transformed into resolve. By summer's end, the trap was ready. The only thing left was to bait Varus, a task that Arminius knew would be almost too easy. After all, nothing is easier than tricking a man who thinks he can't be tricked. Arminius had spent enough time with Roman governors to know one universal truth. The more incompetent the official, the more sure he was of his own genius. Publius Quintilius Varus was the living embodiment of this rule. Augustus had sent him to govern Germania as though he were moving a tax accountant to a distant office. Varus expected paperwork, not warfare. He thought the Germans just needed a firm Roman hand, preferably his own, to civilize them. And because arrogance rarely travels alone, he also believed Arminius was his loyal ally. This was the weakness Arminius intended to exploit. He began feeding Varus carefully crafted lies. That a rebellion had erupted in a remote region, that certain tribes were restless, that Roman authority was being questioned. Nothing dramatic, just enough to poke at Varus's pride. Varus had spent months forcing Roman law upon people who didn't want. The idea that anyone would dare to stand up to him was unacceptable. Arminius played him like a harp, plucking each string until Varus convinced himself that the situation needed his personal attention. The brilliance of the deception lay in its subtlety. Arminius never pushed too hard or raised his voice. He simply reported concerns, offered to guide the legions, and assured Varus that he had everything under control. In doing so, he reinforced the governor's favorite story that Rome had. Arminius successfully Romanized a German prince who was eager to prove his loyalty. Varus believed it completely. As summer came to an end, Arminius suggested that the legions march into the Teutberg region to deal with the supposed uprising. Varus, who was sure of his authority and even more sure of Arminius, agreed right away. He gathered 3 legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, along with auxiliaries, camp followers, merchants, and wagons. It was not a quick strike force. It was a slow-moving parade of men who believed the forests were just there to look nice, but some Roman officers weren't so easily fooled. Segestes, a Germanic noble who didn't trust Arminius, told Varus straight out, "Don't trust this man. He's plotting against you." But Varus didn't listen. Why? Because Varus trusted paperwork, ranks, and Roman titles, and Arminius had all of those. When the march started, Arminius rode next to Varus, his face calm, his voice loyal, and his heart burning. He told Varus the path was safe. Varus told the tribes that they needed Roman help. He told Varus exactly what the governor wanted to hear. But behind the polite smiles, The biggest ambush in Roman history was already happening. The march started under a sky that promised rain. This wasn't an unusual sign in Germania, but it was one that the Romans should have taken more seriously. The Teutoburg forest was thick, old, and very unfriendly to travelers who relied on straight roads and wide formations. Rome had built its empire on open land where legions could spread their wings and let discipline do the killing. But in Germania, the trees closed in like walls. The ground turned to sucking mud, and visibility shrank until the world became a narrow corridor of dripping leaves. Ferris, oblivious, pressed forward. He brought with him not just soldiers, but entire civilian entourages, cooks, smiths, merchants, servants, and animals. This wasn't an army on high alert. It was a mobile administration office. The column stretched for miles, winding through forest paths like a silver snake. The trees in Germania closed in like walls, and the ground turned to sucking mud. Visibility shrank until the world became a narrow corridor of dripping leaves. Ferris, who was unaware, pressed on. He brought with him not just soldiers, but also cooks, smiths, merchants, servants, and animals. This wasn't an army on high alert. It was a mobile administration office. The column stretched for miles, winding through forest paths like a silver snake, strangled by vines. And at the head of this unwieldy procession rode Arminius, offering guidance like the perfect ally. Then, at precisely the moment he needed to vanish, Arminius requested permission to gather allied Germanic troops to help subdue the fake rebellion he himself had invented. Varus, convinced of his loyalty, let him go. It was the last decision he made that wasn't soaked in regret. As Arminius disappeared into the trees, the weather turned. Sheets of rain hammered the canopy. Wind howled through the muddy ground turned into a swamp that looked like a road. Roman shields became slippery, and their sandals lost their grip. Wagons flipped over in ditches. Soldiers tried to stay in formation on terrain that punished every step. The Germans couldn't have asked for a better stage. Warriors from many tribes were hidden behind branches, trenches, and natural ridges, waiting for Arminius to rally them over months of secret meetings. Their bodies were painted, their weapons were ready, and their anger grew stronger after years of being humiliated by the Romans. They watched quietly as the Romans sank deeper into the forest, becoming more vulnerable and trapped. Varus still thought he was marching toward a small revolt, but he had no idea that the revolt was behind him, above him, and all around him. And somewhere in the dripping green maze, Arminius raised his arm, the signal he had waited years to give. The forest held its breath. The Romans marched blindly, and Germania prepared to strike. The first attack did not come as a grand clash of armies. It came as a scream, sharp, inhuman, echoing through the dripping branches. A moment later, a volley of spears erupted from the Triine, tearing into the Roman column. Men collapsed before they even understood what was happening. The forest exploded with war cries, the kind that bypassed logic and punched directly into the spine. Germania had been waiting decades for this moment, and it came like a storm, breaking free of its chains. The Romans, trained for open field combat, scrambled to form ranks, but the terrain betrayed them. Centurions shouted for order, but their voices drowned beneath the shrieking wind and the pounding rain. Shields were useless against javelins thrown from above. Swords were too short to reach foes, who struck and vanished into the woods. The forest was not a battlefield. It was an execution chamber. Arminius's warriors struck from all sides, disappearing as quickly as they appeared. A few rushed forward to attack, but they fell back before the legions could respond. Others targeted officers, cutting off command before it could stabilize the line. Everywhere Varus looked, the trees themselves seemed alive with movement. Shadows flickering, blades flashing, enemies attacking and vanishing like ghosts. Wagons overturned, blocking the narrow path. Horses panicked, trampling soldiers. Supply mules broke free and scattered into the forest. And as confusion spread, the rain intensified, turning the ground into a sucking mire that pinned Roman sandals like traps. Discipline, Rome's greatest weapon, dissolved into clumps of terrified men fighting in isolation. Varus attempted to regroup, calling for a fortified camp, but building defenses in the midst of chaos proved nearly impossible, and while the Romans dug trenches and erected makeshift walls from shields and debris, Germanic warriors continued their harassment, raining spears into the half-built camp until nightfall. When darkness came, it offered no. The Romans huddled together, wet and shaking, listening to the taunting shouts from the forest. German mania had not just attacked, it was enjoying the moment. Warriors sang victory songs, and drums echoed like thunder. To the Romans, it sounded like the forest itself was celebrating their doom. Varus tried to keep up the illusion of control, but even he knew the truth. They were not fighting an enemy. They were being hunted, and Arminius, the man he trusted, was the hunter leading them into the abyss. By dawn, the Romans were. They were no longer marching. They were fleeing in slow motion. Exhaustion clung to them like wet cloth. The makeshift camp they left behind looked less like a military fortification and more like the remains of a disaster site. Varus tried to restore order, but his voice had lost its authority. Men looked at him not as a general, but as a man who had led them into a nightmare and had no idea how to lead them out. Arminius, on the other hand, had returned to his warriors, no longer hiding his allegiance. His calm Roman exterior was gone, replaced by a Germanic war leader whose knowledge of Roman tactics now guided the destruction of 3 entire legions. He divided his forces into flexible bands, each assigned to choke points along the Romans' escape route. Every ravine, every slope, every bend in the forest had been chosen in advance. Germania itself had become a trap designed by someone who knew exactly how Roman formations needed to move and how to stop them from moving at all. As the Romans attempted to advance, the path narrowed into a ridge with steep drops on either side. This is where the next wave crashed down. Germanic warriors rolled boulders and cut down trees, crushing ranks and blocking retreat. Javelins fell again, but this time the Romans were too close together to move their shields. Screams echoed through the chaos, as soldiers fell into the ravines, slipping in mud slicked with blood. Varus told the legions to break out, but his orders turned into panic. The 17th fell apart first. The eagle standard, which was the soul of the legion, was lost in the fight. When a Roman legion lagged its eagle, it usually meant death. Here, it was just the first sign. The 18th was next, collapsing under constant attacks from above. Whole cohorts were pinned against the slope, unable to climb, fight, or escape. The Germans attacked with rage, sharpened by years of humiliation. Each blow was a rejection of Roman rule. The 19th was surrounded, cut off, and slowly, strangled by ambush after ambush. A legion, trained to fight in open fields, now died in pieces, scattered through dripping forests that turned every tree into a spear and every shadow into a killer. Varus realized he had lost not just the battle, but the empire's illusion of invincibility. Somewhere among the wreckage of men and armor, one truth settled over the survivors like a burial shroud. This was not a revolt, it was retribution. By the third day, the Teutoburg forest had become a graveyard. The Romans were not. They weren't just defeated, they were wiped out. 3 legions that had once been the pride of the empire were no longer there. Their eagle standards were lost in the mud and the trees. Their officers were scattered among broken equipment, crushed wagons, and corpses half buried in swampy soil. And in the middle of all this, Varus, realizing how badly he had failed, fell on his own sword, choosing death over the shame of being captured. When word got to Rome, Emperor Augustus reportedly tore his robes and shouted, "Quintilictius Varus, give me back my legions." But there were no legions to give back. Arminius had not won a battle. He had torn a hole in Roman history that would never fully close. For the Germans, the victory was earth-shaking. Tribes that had once squabbled over pasture land suddenly stood united in triumph. Arminius was hailed as a liberator, a man who had done what no one believed possible: humiliate the greatest military power in the known world. The forest where the ambush took place became holy ground. It showed that cleverness and bravery could beat imperial arrogance. But victory came with its own problems. Arminius was no longer just a military leader. He was a symbol, and symbols attract rivals. Some chieftains were afraid he wanted to make himself king, which was something Germans traditionally hated. His uncle, who had been hostile toward him for a long time, repeatedly denounced him to Rome and urged internal opposition. Political divisions began to reopen. Tribal leaders who had united against. Varus and the others went back to their old grudges. Their temporary alliance fell apart because of personal ambition. Rome was hurt, but not broken. Germanicus, a famous general and adopted son of Emperor Tiberius, launched several campaigns to get revenge for the Teutoburg disaster. He beat Arminius in several open battles, got back some of the lost eagle standards, and showed that Rome still had teeth. But even Germanicus couldn't fully conquer Germania. The land was too wild, and the tribes were too spread out. Arminius survived Rome's punishments, but not his own people. His power scared rival nobles who saw in him the shadow of monarchy. In 21 CE, They killed him. He was a liberator, killed not by invaders, but by the very leaders he fought to free. Arminius died at 37, but his legacy lived on. He was the man who stopped Rome and made sure Germania would never be a Roman province. When Qin Shang finally united the warring states in 221 BCE, he was not happy with just ending centuries of bloodshed. He wanted to remake China, itself, its laws, its infrastructure, its identity, and its borders. And he wanted those borders to stay quiet. The northern frontier, however, had no interest in cooperating. Beyond the cultivated fields and newly conquered towns lay the steppes, home to the Xiongnu horsemen who rode like the wind, raiders who appeared and vanished before infantry could form ranks, and enemies who refused to recognize the concept of a fixed frontier. For generations, these northern nomads had harassed the states. Of Zhao, Yan, and Qin, their cavalry could cross vast distances in a day, burning settlements and seizing livestock. Now that the first emperor ruled a united land, he had no patience for an enemy that didn't respect walls or the men who built them. His solution was ambitious, brutal, and terrifying in scale. He ordered the linking and reinforcement of the old border fortifications built by the defeated states. What once were scattered defensive lines would become a single, continuous barrier stretching across. Mountains, deserts, and wilderness. The idea wasn't entirely new. The states of Qin, Jiao, and Yan had already experimented with walls centuries earlier, but Qin Xiang envisioned something far greater. A spine of stone, earth, and wood that would mark the northern limit of civilization and keep the barbarians out. It wasn't simply a military project. It was a symbol, a declaration of permanence from a ruler obsessed with making his rule eternal. But even grand visions come with a cost. And the emperor had a unique way to deal with labor shortages. He would use people who had made him angry. Tens of thousands of conscripted peasants, soldiers, debtors, and prisoners were sent to the frontier. Many had been punished for criticizing imperial reforms, failing to pay taxes, or even being related to someone who offended an official. Now they marched north in chains, not knowing if they would build a wall, freeze on a mountainside, or simply disappear. Qin Suang's architects assured him it could be done. His generals assured him it would be worthwhile. His officials assured him the people would obey. And so the project began. A colossal undertaking meant to secure an empire, define a civilization, and leave behind a monument that would outlive every man who touched it. A monument that would become, for many, not a wall, but a tomb. The order to build the wall spread through the newly unified empire like a winter wind, cold, sudden, and impossible to ignore. Imperial officials appeared in villages with wooden tablets, listing names, quotas, and penalties. Men between 15 and 50 were expected to serve. Farmers were taken from their fields, artisans from their workshops, and soldiers from their barracks. Some went willingly, believing the emperor's promise of strengthened borders. Most went because refusal meant death Chinlaw was famously unforgiving, and the wall was built on that unforgiving foundation. For many families, the moment of conscription felt like a funeral. Mothers watched their sons depart, knowing the northern frontier was a place where even seasoned soldiers were afraid to go. Wives stood silently as their husbands were marched away in chains, not knowing if they would ever come back. The emperor's order did not make a distinction between the innocent and the unlucky. Even those accused of minor crimes, such as late taxes, unregistered tools, or disrespecting local officials, were branded as laborers and sent to the worst work sites in the realm. Convoys of prisoners, peasants, and soldiers stretched across the roads of Chin. Thousands of people walked in a straight line while overseers yelled orders. They only had basic tools like wicker baskets for dirt, crude chisels for rock, and wooden poles for scaffolding. When they got to the border, there were no inns, warm shelters, or tidy barracks waiting for them. Instead, they found jagged mountainsides, barren deserts, and a wind so strong it seemed like it wanted to tear flesh from bone. Work started before dawn and didn't stop until the stars came back. Overseers used whips to keep people in line, and rods. Food was scarce, often just millet gruel, and water had to be brought from faraway streams or melted from snow. Workers who passed out were given a few minutes to recover, but only a few. The emperor wanted things done quickly, and speed required sacrifices. But even in the middle of all the cruelty, there was a strange sense of unity. Soldiers who had once served rival kingdoms now worked side by side to haul stones. Criminals worked next to peasants who had never broken a law in their lives. Under Qin rule, everyone was equal in. No one was allowed to stop working. As the first foundations took shape, the workers realized something that scared them more than the northern winds. This was not a temporary project. This was their life now. For months, years, or however long their bodies could stand it, the wall was rising, and its builders were disappearing into it. The northern frontier was nothing was like the fertile heartland the workers had left behind. There were no familiar rice terraces or gentle rivers winding through valleys. The Great Wall was to be built in a place where nature itself fought against human presence. In the west, the land turned into the dry breath of the Gobi Desert, where dunes shifted like living beasts and swallowed roads overnight. Farther east, the Yin Mountains rose, jagged ranges that tore at the sky and forced men to cling to rocks like insects. Everywhere else lay unforgiving plains patrolled by Zeong new scouts who watched the construction from a distance with cold curiosity. For the laborers, the frontier felt like exile. Winters came early, covering the ground in snow that never fully melted. Winds screamed across the landscape, bringing sand that scoured faces and ice that cracked wooden scaffolding. Some days, men worked wrapped in layers of woven grass to keep their skin from freezing. Other days, they worked shirtless in the blistering summer heat, their sweat evaporating faster than it formed. Shelter was a luxury they rarely enjoyed. Camps were little more than fabric tents weighed down with stones or The land grudgingly gave up a few shrubs and branches to fuel small fires. At night, the howls of wolves mixed with the groans of tired men, creating a chorus of suffering that echoed across the valleys. Those who died on the way north were left by the side of the road, and those who died during construction were often buried under the nearest mound of earth. Sometimes there was no ceremony, and sometimes work stopped for a moment. But nature wasn't the only danger. Thiangu. They lurked like shadows on horseback, watching the progress of their enemy's new barrier. They launched sudden raids on supply convoys, cut down stragglers, and sometimes circled the work sites just close enough to taunt the workers with shouts and arrows. Work would halt only long enough for Chin soldiers to chase the attackers off, and then the overseers would force the exhausted laborers back into their lines. But the harshness of the frontier served the emperor's purpose. Here, no one could escape. Here, men disappeared, their names faded away, leaving no trace. And here, in this mix of ice, sand, and stone, the first real parts of the Chin Wall began to rise. It was a monument to power, built in a place where people had to push their bodies to the limit. The Qin Empire didn't have modern cranes, iron machines, or mathematical surveying tools for large-scale construction. Instead, it had thousands of human bodies and a ruler whose will was unbreakable. The methods for building the wall were different, depending on the terrain, but they all shared one truth. Every meter required immense back-breaking labor. In the deserts and plains, the builders used a technique called rammed earth, layering soil, gravel, and clay between wooden frames. Teams of men beat the mixture with heavy wooden rammers, their rhythmic thudding echoing across the landscape like the heartbeat of a great beast. This method produced walls dense enough to resist the weather and tall enough to intimidate raiders. But the work was punishing. Shoulders dislocated, palms blistered open, and men collapsed in the dust from dehydration. In the mountains, the task grew even more brutal. Workers carved paths into cliff sides, hauling stones up steep slopes that seemed determined to throw them back down. Ropes snapped, scaffolding collapsed, slabs of granite slid like avalanches, crushing those unfortunate enough to stand in their path. To the overseers, these deaths were simply part of the cost. "Replace them," they ordered, waving. The next line of trembling workers moved forward. Oxen-drawn carts carried materials over dangerous terrain, but the paths often became too narrow, steep, or muddy. When the animals couldn't go any farther, men took their place, pulling, pushing, and dragging loads with ropes dug into their shoulders until their skin tore. The air was filled with grunts, shouted orders, cracking whips, and the constant pounding of rammers. Despite the pain, the wall grew steadily. Watchtowers rose above thee. The landscape was changed to make it easier for soldiers to see the dust trails of Xiong's new riders. Trenches were dug, barracks were built, and the wall began to stitch itself across the frontier like a scar, marking the border between the civilized world and the wild. But for the men who built it, the wall was not a marvel of engineering. It was a chain. And every stone, every handful of earth, and every timber hammered into place carried the memory of someone who had fallen along the way. The emperor saw progress. The overseers saw discipline. The workers saw only one truth. This wall demanded more than labor. It demanded lives. As the wall stretched farther across the frontier, the cost in human life became impossible to hide. Though the Qin state did not bother trying, death was an expected expense. Officials recorded supplies, tools, and measurements with meticulous precision, but they rarely recorded the dead. A man who collapsed from exhaustion was replaced before his body cooled. A man buried in a landslide became part of the earthwork. Illness spread through the camps with terrifying speed: dysentery, fever, frostbite, and infections from untreated wounds. For many laborers, survival became less likely than death. Food shortages were constant. The frontier could not sustain large populations, and the empire struggled to transport enough grain across long distances. When supplies ran low, soldiers ate first, overseers ate second, the workers ate last, if anything remained. Some laborers boiled grass into a bitter soup. Others chewed on leather straps to trick their bodies into thinking they were fed. Men weakened quickly, and the weaker they grew, the more likely they were to become casualties of the next day's labor. Punishments were brutal and public. A man who slowed down the workforce could be tied to a post and whipped until he could stand again or until he could not. Those accused of sabotage, disobedience, or escape attempts faced execution on the spot. Their bodies were sometimes buried under the wall itself, not out of ceremony but convenience. Whether this was truly inhunement in the wall or simply careless burial, the effect was the same. The wall became a grave for countless unnamed souls. Despite the harshness, rumors spread among the workers. Some believed that the emperor intended the wall to last forever, not just as a military defense, but as a monument to his reign. Others whispered that Qin Shi Huang was terrified of death and sought permanence in structures that could outlive him, too. The builders' anger only grew as they heard these whispers. They weren't suffering for a cause or for their own safety. They were suffering for the ambition of one man. But even in their despair, moments of humanity shone through. Workers shared their last bits of food. Old veterans taught younger men how to wrap cloth around their shoulders to protect them. At night, men sang songs about their homes, reminding each other that they had lived real lives before becoming faceless workers in the emperor's machine. Still, the truth remained. The wall was getting bigger, and men were dying faster than the empire could replace them. Each new section that was finished was both a triumph of engineering and a reminder of the thousands who had died beneath it. The wall rose higher, and the emperor's shadow grew longer. The workers who built the wall were paying a high price, and the soldiers stationed along the frontier were too. They were not just guards, they were symbols of Qin authority and extensions of the emperor's will. Even though they were very strict, they couldn't hide the fact that this was one of the hardest jobs in the empire. Many of them had fought bravely in Qin's wars of unification, but now they were stationed on top of windy ridges, staring into a horizon that promised only danger. Their duty was never ending. Every watchtower needed to be watched around the clock, especially at night when the Jonggu were most likely to attack. Soldiers huddled around small fires, gripping their spears and listening to them. The northern winds gnawed at them just as mercilessly as they did the workers. Armor offered little warmth. Cloaks froze stiff. In winter, even drawing breath felt like inhaling knives. Though soldiers received better rations than laborers, shortages struck them, too. Supplies struggled to cross mountains or snow blocked passes, and convoys risked ambush. When grain failed to arrive, soldiers went hungry alongside the men they guarded. And unlike the laborers who could fall apart without any consequences, soldiers were expected to keep going. A weak guard post could put an entire stretch of the frontier in danger. Tensions rose between the two groups. Soldiers enforced order with strict authority, forcing workers to keep going even when they were too tired to hold their hands steady. But many soldiers quietly sympathized with the workers, seeing the same fear in their eyes. They were afraid of a landscape that killed as ruthlessly as any enemy. Some secretly shared food or water, small gestures that could have led to severe punishment if discovered. Punishment if discovered. And then there were the battles. While the wall was under construction, new raiders launched sudden attacks to disrupt progress. They targeted isolated camps, supply caravans, and partly completed fortifications. Soldiers sprinted across ridges to repel these assaults, often fighting outnumbered, their feet slipping on loose earth or icy stone. Many fell from cliffs or were struck down before reinforcements could arrive. When the fighting ended, the soldiers returned to their posts, knowing that their victories were short-lived, but their losses were permanent. The wall may have been built for defense, but during its construction, it felt more like a provocation, a reminder to the new that Qin intended to claim the frontier. And the soldiers stationed there understood a painful truth. They were defending a project that was still incomplete, still vulnerable, and still costing lives every single day. Even the army, the pride of Qin, could feel the emperor's ambition pressing down like a weight. They might never be able to get away. As months turned into years, the building of the Qin wall became a rhythm that consumed the frontier. Every day began the same way, a whistle from an overseer, the sound of tools being lifted, and thousands of feet trudging to the next unfinished stretch. Progress wasn't measured in miles, but in misery. How many men survived the day? How many collapses could be fixed? How many new sections could be forced into existence before darkness returned? The wall didn't grow in a straight, beautiful line. It twisted along ridges, followed the shapes of mountains, and dipped into valleys where the earth was soft enough to mold. Different areas made different styles. Packed earth in the west, stone layers in the northern mountains, and timber fortifications in forested areas. This patchwork showed how quickly the Qin was growing. Build whatever you can, as long as it stands tall and stands now. For the workers, the wall's progression felt unreal. One morning, they would wake up to find an empty ridge with only a few rocks scattered around. By nightfall, that same ridge would be topped with a crude but impressive rampart, built by thousands of people, breaking, hauling, pounding, and shaping the land. Workers often stared at the newly raised sections with a mix of awe and despair. They were building a monument bigger than themselves, but they had no claim to it. Their names would never be recorded, and their families would never know where. They died, but the work never stopped. When it rained, mud turned to glue, pulling off shoes and trapping carts until teams of men dragged them free. When it was dry, dust storms swallowed whole work sites, forcing workers to cover their faces with scraps of cloth while they hammered earth into place by feel alone. Thunderstorms broke scaffolds, and earthquakes brought down parts that had taken months to build. Each disaster meant doing the same hard work again with even fewer survivors. Empire kept sending more men, fresh criminals, newly conscripted peasants, political offenders. Some arrived defiant, others terrified, but all eventually succumbed to the same exhaustion. They were absorbed into the machine, into the slow and relentless march of expansion. A man had no past on the frontier. He had only the wall in front of him and the overseer behind. As the wall stretched farther, laborers whispered a bitter phrase. The wall grows, the empire grows, but we grow fewer. Yet the project persisted, driven by a single truth. Qin Shuang demanded a barrier that would reshape the world, and the world unwillingly was being reshaped stone by stone, life by life. As the wall crept across the frontier like a giant scar, its purpose expanded far beyond defense. Qin Shang did not merely want to keep invaders out, he wanted to keep his empire in. The wall became a visible reminder of his authority, stretching farther than any messenger could travel in a day. A physical declaration that the emperor's reach extended into the. It was as if he carved his name into the landscape itself, demanding that all who looked upon it remember who commanded heaven and earth. For many in the empire, the wall became a symbol of dread rather than pride. Stories circulated about men who were dragged from their homes simply for criticizing imperial reforms, sentenced to labor on the frontier until their bones gave out. Families whispered warnings to their children. Obey the law or the wall will take you. The very mention of the northern work sites could silence a crowd. It was widely believed that those who vanished into the construction camps were rarely seen again, and the truth was not far from the rumors. Officials, too, used the wall as political leverage. A rival bureaucrat could be accidentally assigned to oversee a remote section, a subtle death sentence disguised as promotion. Even nobles feared offending the wrong minister. The wall was an equalizer in the most brutal sense, stripping away wealth, rank, and. On the frontier, everyone answered to the emperor alone. But Qin propaganda told a different story. Court poets and scholars praised the wall as a dragon of protection, a sacred shield guarding the realm from chaos. Travel records described it as the greatest engineering achievement in history. Statues and inscriptions celebrated the emperor's benevolence in securing peace for future generations. But those who actually worked on the wall knew the truth. It was built with more cruelty than stone. Still, the wall, did its job. The Xiang knew they had to go further north because they were scared of how quickly the barrier was growing. They didn't know how to deal with it because it was growing faster than they could tear it down. Patrols reported fewer raids. Farmers along the inner frontier began to sleep with a little less fear. The Emperor's vision, for all its brutality, was shaping the geopolitical landscape. But beneath this veneer of stability, resentment simmered. Every clenched fist, every unmarked grave, every family mourning sons lost to the frontier held a quiet, dangerous question. How long can an empire last if it is built on suffering? The wall rose higher, the emperor's power grew heavier, and the foundations of rebellion were quietly being laid. By the time Qin Shi Huang died in 210 BCE, the wall stretched across thousands of li, from the deserts of the west to the rugged mountains of the east. It was not a single continuous structure like later dynasties would refine, but it was vast enough to intimidate enemies and or travelers. More importantly, it changed the empire's identity. The Qin Wall was both a great achievement and an open wound, one that pulsed with stories of suffering whispered across generations. After the emperor died, the state he built fell apart very quickly. His successors couldn't keep the lands he had unified together, and rebellion broke out all over the empire. The harsh laws he made, the taxes he demanded, and the never-ending construction projects he forced on the wall, which was once thought of as a protective dragon, was now seen as a monument to oppression. Many veterans of the frontier joined the uprisings, carrying with them scars, both physical and emotional, from their years on the northern ridge. When the Qin dynasty fell and the Han rose in its place, the new rulers inherited the broken pieces of the wall. Instead of abandoning it, they chose to rebuild and expand it, recognizing its strategic value. But unlike the Qin, the Han used diplomacy alongside force, forging alliances with some nomadic groups while reinforcing vulnerable stretches. The wall, once a symbol of the first emperor's obsession, now served a more practical purpose, a managed frontier rather than an impossible barrier. Yet the legacy of the Qin Wall remained unmistakable. In folk tales and songs, it became known as the structure where 10,000 men died, a place where the earth itself held the bones of the forgotten. Archaeologists would later discover graves near ancient sections, confirming the wall, which was once a symbol of the first emperor's obsession, now served a more practical purpose. It was a managed frontier instead of an impossible barrier. The legacy of the Qin Wall was still clear. In folk tales and songs, it became known as the place where 10,000 men died, a place where the earth itself held the bones of the forgotten. Archaeologists would later find graves near ancient sections, confirming what workers had always murmured: the wall consumed lives as readily as it repelled enemies. Even today, stories persist of spirits wandering the old ramparts, echoes of men who never returned home. But despite its grim origins, the wall influenced centuries of Chinese defense strategy and ultimately inspired the far more famous structures we now associate with the Great Wall. Without the Qin, There would be no massive stone ramparts snaking across mountain tops, no watchtowers piercing the sky. No, a huge testament to human endurance. The chin wall is a paradox. It is a masterpiece built from pain, a shield forged through suffering, and a reminder that even the greatest monuments have shadows. The wall survived its builders, but their stories are still buried in it, silent, unmarked, and eternal. The Olympic Games were born in a quiet, fertile valley in the western Pelpine, long before the roar of modern crowds or the gleam of international stadiums. Olympia was not a busy city it was a political powerhouse. It was a sanctuary, an ancient grove where the Greeks believed the presence of gods lingered in the rustling leaves. Here, amidst wild olive trees, marble altars, and the scent of burning offerings, the earliest foundations of the games took shape. The year 776 BCE would later be named the first Olympiad, but the truth was far older. No one can say when the Greeks first gathered to honor Zeus with physical contests. Myths offered competing stories. Some claimed Heracles, fresh from performing his. Legend has it that the games were started by Hercules to thank Zeus for giving him strength. Others say they were started by Pelops, a hero who won a kingdom with his chariot race. All of these stories had one thing in common. They all started with people trying to reach the divine. Olympia was the perfect place for the games because it was a sanctuary that belonged to no one city state. Its temples, treasuries, and altars were neutral ground, protected by religious law. Even enemies were expected to behave with reverence when they entered. And because the Greeks believed Zeus watched from above, every athlete who entered the arena carried not only the pride of their city, but the weight of divine judgment. But the games were not created merely to entertain. They were offerings, gifts of strength, endurance, and courage presented to the gods. Victories brought honor not just to the athlete, but to Zeus himself. Losing was not shameful, failing to give one's best. Law. Even enemies were expected to behave with reverence upon entering its boundaries. And because the Greeks believed Zeus watched from above, every athlete who entered the arena carried not only the pride of their city, but the weight of divine judgment. But the games were not created merely to entertain. They were offerings, gifts of strength, endurance, and courage presented to the gods. Victories brought honor not just to the athlete, but to Zeus himself. Losing was not shameful, failing to give one's best. Effort was. It was said that an athlete must compete for the glory of Zeus alone, a reminder that ambition was allowed, but arrogance was not. As pilgrims gathered from distant lands, Sparta, Corinth, Athens, Elis, they arrived with the same awe one might bring to a sacred pilgrimage. They came bearing sacrifices, prayers, and hopes. Before any race could begin, before any athlete could be crowned, priests lit the sacred fire at the altar of Zeus, its smoke rising into the sky as an invitation to the divine. In that, in that moment, the world of mortals stopped. Ritual took the place of rivalry, and piety took the place of politics. From this sacred space, the Olympic Games came to be, not as a sport, but as a holy conversation between humans and gods. This conversation would soon bring all of Greece together. To understand the true power of the ancient Olympics, one must first understand Greece in the 8th century BCE, a land of fierce independence, proud rivalries, and constant conflict. City states like Sparta, Athens, Argos, and Corinth were more than just neighbors, they were. People fought over politics, trade, and war. Feuds could last for generations. Borders changed with each season. People didn't trust each other. But every 4 years, something amazing happened. A divine peace known as the Ekeria, or sacred truce, was declared across the Greek world. Heralds traveled from Olympia to the farthest city-states to tell everyone that all fighting must stop during the upcoming games. Soldiers were told to put down their spears, and generals put off their campaigns. Even bitter enemies agreed, if only for a short time, temporarily, to honor the will of Zeus. This truce was not a polite suggestion, it was a sacred obligation. Violating it meant offending the king of the gods himself, an act considered reckless at best and suicidal at worst. The Greeks believed that the gods watched over the games with sharp, discerning eyes, ready to punish those who disrespected their festival. The practical effects were astonishing. Roads that were usually dangerous suddenly became safe. Pilgrims could walk hundreds of miles across mountains. Athletes, coaches, poets, merchants, and spectators traveled to Olympia in long caravans, united by a purpose greater than politics. For many Greeks, the journey itself was a spiritual transformation. A Spartan might travel next to an Athenian without reaching for a weapon. A Corinthian merchant might share a wineskin with a Theban storyteller by the roadside. These were encounters that never would have happened in wartime, and in Greece, most of the time, it was wartime. The sacred truce also marked the start of ritual preparations. In each city, families chose which athlete would represent them. Noble houses boasted of sons training for glory, gyms and running tracks filled with hopeful competitors. Even the poorest villagers dreamed of seeing Olympia, perhaps for the first and only time in their lives. As the days passed, excitement spread. When the heralds' voices echoed across the hills, announcing the exact date of the games, Greece came together for a rare moment. The truce didn't end rivalries, but it did raise something more important: the shared belief that honoring Zeus and celebrating excellence was worth stopping the endless cycle of war. During those sacred weeks, Greece remembered what it meant to be one people. Finally, all roads led to Olympia, where the Greek world seemed to breathe deeply and just for a moment stop preparing for war. Roads that had once belonged to armies, now filled with pilgrims carrying offerings, travelers seeking spectacle, and athletes chasing immortality. For many, the journey to Olympia was as important as the games themselves, a pilgrimage of devotion, endurance, and anticipation. Athletes often traveled months in advance, accompanied by trainers, family members, and supporters. Some came from wealthy city states and arrived with well-ended entourages. Others came barefoot from remote villages, carrying little more than a bronze straddle and a bag of figs. Everyone walked the same dusty paths, cooked over the same roadside fires, and looked west with a mix of nerves and excitement. Along the way, small towns and sanctuaries offered places to rest, pray, and get ready. Inns were full, and merchants set up stalls selling oil, salted fish, pottery, and amulets that were said to bring Zeus's favor. Poets and musicians played for coins, turning the journey into a moving festival. Even storytellers drew crowds by telling stories about the victories of legendary athletes who had lifted bulls, outrun horses, or been crowned the 3, 4, or even 5 times. But the pilgrimage wasn't just a party, it was a test. Athletes were expected to follow strict moral and physical rules on the road. They trained in the mornings, stayed away from too much food or wine, and slept on hard surfaces to get their bodies ready. They prayed every day, avoided impurity, and saw the journey not as a vacation, but as the start of the competition. The closer they got to Olympia, the atmosphere became more and more reverent. Travelers crossed rivers that were thought to be sacred, passed shrines to Hermes and Apollo, and walked under huge oak trees that were said to whisper oracles. The landscape itself seemed to get them ready for what was to come. Finally, after long days of marching, the travelers reached the Altus, the sacred grove that housed temples, treasuries, altars, and statues. The smell of burning incense filled the air. Priests tended to sacred fires, and above all stood the huge temple of Zeus, its pediments. Shining in the sun, it was so big that even the bravest athlete felt small. For many pilgrims, stepping into Olympia felt like stepping out of the mortal world entirely, a place where gods watched from every shadow, a place where the greatest feats of human ability were expected, not exceptional, a place where legends were born. Long before a single runner set foot on the track or a wrestler squared his stance, the ancient Olympics began with rituals, solemn, magnificent, and deeply rooted in the Greek relationship. For the gods, for the Greeks, athletic competition was pointless unless it honored the gods. Zeus, the king of Olympus, demanded nothing less than perfection. The day before the games officially opened, the Altus turned into a huge ceremonial theater. Thousands of people gathered around the great altar of Zeus, a huge mound of ash made from centuries of burnt offerings. Priests dressed in white moved slowly, their voices rising in hymns older than any recorded Olympiad. The air thickened with the Bulletarian, or council hall, was where the athletes took part in a sacred oath ceremony. They stood in front of the statue of Zeus Hyos, Zeus of oaths, and swore to follow the rules of the games, compete fairly, and train hard for the required 10 months. If they broke the oath, they would not only be punished by officials, but also by the gods. No man dared lie in front of Zeus's steely gaze. Parents and spectators also. People offered sacrifices like small bronze statues, coins, olive wreaths, and textiles. These were signs of thanks or desperate prayer. A father might sacrifice a goat in the hope that his son would come back victorious. A pilgrim might bring a simple offering of barley cake, asking only for a safe trip home. The value of the gift didn't matter as much as the sincerity behind it. The most dramatic ritual was the hecatomb, a public sacrifice of 100 cattle to Zeus. As each animal fell, its blood soaked into the sacred earth, symbolizing purification and awe. The best meat was burned for the god. The rest would later feed thousands in a huge communal feast. In this shared meal, rivalry softened. Athletes who would soon battle in the stadium sat side by side, tasting the same sacred food. Musicians played flutes. Poets recited hymns celebrating Zeus heroes and past Olympic champions. Children ran between the crowds, carrying olive leaves from the sacred grove. Even the wind seemed to hush, as if the world were pausing for the ritual to settle across the land. Only after the sacrifices were accepted and Zeus was honored could the games begin. Without the blessing of the Father of gods, no victory meant anything, and without ritual, the Olympics were not competition, they were sacrilege. With the rituals complete and Zeus duly honored, the sanctuary of Olympia shifted from a solemn temple ground into the heart of the Greek world's greatest festival. The first official moment of the Games was the opening procession, a spectacle that captured the spirit of unity the Olympics were meant to embody. At dawn, a trumpet blast echoed through the Altus, bouncing off marble columns and rustling the sacred grove. Athletes, judges, officials, and heralds gathered at the entrance of the sanctuary, each representing a different city state, each carrying the pride of their homeland on their shoulders. Despite Greece being a patchwork of independent and often hostile polis, the procession presented a vision of what unity could look like. Leading the march were the Hellenodikai, the judges of the games. They were chosen from the city of Elis and trained for months to learn the rules, the rituals, and how Olympic officials should act. They wore flowing robes and walked with a solemn dignity. Their authority came not from law, but from Zeus himself. Behind them came the athletes, moving in orderly lines, their bodies shining with oil and their muscles carved by months of hard training. Some had the rugged physique of Spartans, hardened by discipline since childhood. Others had the proud elegance of Athenian competitors, trained in gymnasia filled with philosophers and poets. Still others came from distant colonies. Magna Graecia in Italy, Ionia on the coast of Asia Minor, even Cyrene in North Africa. When they marched together, it stretched across the sanctuary like a living tapestry of Greek identity. Following the athletes were ambassadors, musicians, priests, and representatives of various cities. Many carried offerings, ornate bronze tripods, carved wooden statues, or childhood. Others carried the proud elegance of Athenian competitors, trained in gymnasia, filled with philosophers and poets. Still others came from distant colonies. Magna Graecia in Italy, Ionia on the coast of Asia Minor, even Cyrene in North Africa. When they marched together, it stretched across the sanctuary like a living tapestry of Greek identity. Following the athletes were ambassadors, musicians, priests, and representatives of various cities. Many carried offerings, ornate bronze tripods, carved wooden statues, or dedications to Zeus and Hera. Chants and songs accompanied the march, blending reverence with celebration. The procession wound its way past the temples, the treasuries, and finally into the stadium. An elongated bowl carved into the landscape. No seats existed. Spectators stood or squatted on grassy embankments, thousands crowding shoulder to shoulder. When the athletes entered, a roar rose from the spectators, a thunderous greeting from all of Greece. In that moment, differences dissolved. Spartans stood near Athenians without, exchanging insults. Archives applauded Corinthians. Families wept with pride as sons stepped into the arena of heroes. The opening procession did more than begin the games. It reminded a fractured world that for 5 sacred days all Greeks walked the same ground under the same sky before the same God. When the procession ended and the athletes took their places, all eyes turned toward the stadium, an elongated grassy field carved directly into the earth. Unlike the marble arenas of later centuries, the early Olympic Stadium didn't have stone seating, tall walls, or fancy decorations. It was meant to be simple. The Greeks thought that athletic competitions shouldn't take away from the purity of the competition or the presence of the divine. This wasn't entertainment, it was a sacred test of human excellence before the gods. The stadium was about 192 meters long, which is the length of one stadium, the unit that gave the world the word stadium. Starting lines carved into stone and worn down stood at each end, smooth from years of bare feet. Men of all ages, priests with serious looks on their faces, aristocrats in fine cloaks, travelers from faraway lands, and even philosophers who wanted to see physical ideals in action lined the embankments. Women, on the other hand, were not allowed to attend. Only priestesses of deer were allowed inside. The games were only for men. When the herald stepped forward and raised his hand, a hush fell over the field. His voice rang out across the field, announcing the start of the first and oldest event, the stayed race, a full sprint from one end of the stadium to the other. The athletes took their positions, toes pressed into small grooves in the stone, bodies coiled like bowstrings. Their skin glistened with olive oil, dusted lightly with sand to help their grip. There were no lanes, no starting pistol, only the herald's signal. A single trumpet note pierced the air. The runners exploded forward. Spectators roared as the athlete shot across the field, arms pumping, legs. There were crashes, elbows thrown, and bursts of desperate speed as each man tried to prove that he was not only fast, but also favored by God. Victory was decided by inches. When the first runner crossed the finish line, a wave of shouts went up in the stadium. His name would be remembered forever, not as a champion of his city, but as the winner of an Olympiad. But sprinting was only the beginning. The next days would bring wrestling, boxing, the brutal pancration, chariot racing, and more. Races and pentathlon contests that tested strength, skill, and endurance. But standing in that stadium, hearing the thunder of feet and the cries of thousands, one truth became clear. The Olympic Games were more than competition. They were a declaration of human potential, performed under the watchful gaze of Zeus himself, and every athlete who stepped onto that sacred ground knew this was where mortals proved they were worthy of memory. While the sprint opened the games, it was only the first spark in a blaze of competition. The ancient Olympics were a series of events that were meant to do more than just entertain. They were meant to test the full range of human ability. Winning an Olympia was like becoming immortal. The Greeks thought that true excellence, arteta, was the closest mortals could get to being divine. One of the most popular events was the wrestling match, which tested strength, balance, and willpower. Wrestlers covered themselves in olive oil and then dust to improve their grip, with their hair tied in bodies. They entered the sandy arena like statues brought to life, shining. The athlete who forced his opponent to touch the ground the 3 times won. The battles were silent, intense, and deceptively graceful, with two bodies intertwined in a dance that tested every muscle and breath. Boxing was much more brutal than it is now. Fighters wrapped their hands in leather thongs called himantes, which were sometimes stiffened with wool or metal. There were no rounds, weight classes, or time limits. The match ended when someone collapsed, gave up, or died. Faces were smashed, ribs cracked, and teeth were scattered across the sand. But the boxers were respected by the crowd because they thought their bravery honored Zeus. The pancration, on the other hand, was the real test of bravery. It was a mix of wrestling and boxing with almost no rules. Kicking, holds, chokes, throws, and joint locks were all allowed, but biting and eye gouging were not. However, desperate athletes sometimes tried them anyway. The winners of the pancreas were celebrated as the strongest, most unbeatable warriors of Greece. Olympians who triumphed in this event often went on to command armies or become legends in their cities. The pentathlon showcased versatility: discus, javelin, long jump, a short sprint, and wrestling. Pentathletes were admired for their balance of speed, agility, and precision. Watching a discus arc through the air or a javelin whistle across the field was like witnessing mastery in motion, a reminder that the Olympics celebrated beauty as much as strength. And then there were the equestrian, not in the stadium, but in the huge hippodrome. Chariot races were wild, dangerous, and exciting. Horses crashed into each other, chariots flipped over, and dust storms swallowed whole teams. But winning was a huge honor, not for the driver, but for the rich owner who paid for the team. Each event at Olympia showed a different side of human excellence. Some showed precision, others courage, and others pure endurance, but all of them paid tribute to the gods in their own way. Brilliantly, even if only for a fleeting moment in the sun. Victory at the ancient Olympics was not decided by medals, nor by national anthems, nor by podium ceremonies. It was determined by a single moment, a judge raising his hand and declaring one name aloud. And with that declaration, an athlete stepped into immortality. Winners were summoned to the temple of Zeus, where the air hung heavy with incense and echoes of hymns. Before the assembly of priests, judges, and thousands of spectators, each victor, He stood there with his chest bare, bruised, tired, and glowing with victory. His body showed signs of battle, scratches from wrestling, swollen knuckles from boxing, and dust and sweat dried on his skin. But none of this took away from his glory. To win at Olympia was to be touched by divine favor. The crowning ceremony began with praise to Zeus. A priest cut branches from the sacred olive tree that Heracles was thought to have planted. These branches were long and thin and were woven into a simple wreath. The sea knows there were no jewels or gold, just olive leaves, which stand for peace, virtue, and purity. But the simplicity was misleading. This wreath was worth more than any treasure. It told all of Greece that the winner had achieved aret, the highest level of excellence. His name would be remembered forever. His city state would honor him as a hero. Poets might write about him forever. Sculptors might carve his likeness for the altars. Families would talk about him for generations. As the wreath was placed on the winner's head, when the champions returned home, they were greeted as conquering heroes. City gates opened wide to let them in, and people who had traveled hundreds of miles felt lucky to have witnessed history. Children stared with shining eyes. Old warriors nodded with respect. Even rivals, those he had defeated, often embraced him, acknowledging the divine nature of his achievement. But the celebration did not end at Olympia. When champions returned home, they were greeted as conquering heroes. City gates were sometimes torn down so that the winner could enter through a breach, symbolizing that his victory made the city stronger. Some received free meals for life. Others were granted pensions, statues, or even political office. Yet, most champions insisted that these earthly honors were secondary. What mattered most was the wreath itself, the knowledge that they had honored Zeus, honored their city, and proven themselves worthy before all of Greece. For in the sacred valley of Olympia, even the briefest moment of victory echoed across centuries, carried by the leaves of a simple olive crown. When the final contest ended and the victors were crowned, Olympia gradually returned to its sacred quiet. Athletes packed their gear, priests extinguished ritual fires, and caravans began the long journey home. But the echo of the games did not fade. It lingered, carried on songs, inscribed on stone, immortalized in memory. What happened in Olympia every 4 years was more than a festival. It was a cultural engine powerful enough to outlast kingdoms, wars, and civilizations that changed. The games became a way to mark time. Greeks didn't measure history by dynasties or conquests, but by Olympiads, 4 year cycles that linked the Greek world into a single timeline. A victory at the Olympics wasn't just an athletic achievement, it was a moment that would be remembered by the whole civilization. Cities bragged about their champions in the same way that others bragged about their walls or temples. A single victory at Olympia could make a modest pace famous. What made the games last so long was their spirit of unity. Every 4 years, enemies became pilgrims, rivals became spectators, and Greece remembered for a short time, but strongly, that it was a cultural family connected by language, religion, and tradition. The Olympics kept the idea of a shared Greek identity alive, even during times when politics tore the region apart. Philosophers, playwrights, and historians praise the games as the purest expression of arete, the striving for excellence in body, mind, and soul. The festival grew over the years, with new events and temples being built. Artists, poets, and sculptors came to Olympia to show off their work. Winners had statues made of themselves, some standing proudly, and others showing the exact pose that won their race or match. For many people who came to watch, walking through Olympia felt like walking through a gallery of living legends. But nothing lasts forever. When Rome finally took over Greece, the games went on, but they slowly changed. Roman emperors fought for fame. Money was more important than purity. In the 4th century CE, the Christian Roman Empire banned pagan festivals. Olympia fell silent. Temples fell down. The sacred fire went out. But the memory never died. Centuries later, when modern nations wanted a symbol of peaceful competition and shared humanity, they looked back to Olympia. They brought back the Games not as a religious festival, but as a global celebration of athletic excellence. Today's Olympics, with all there. That simple sprint in 776 BCE has grown into a global event with technology and a lot of attention. It started in a sacred grove with the offerings to Zeus and has become a tradition that crosses continents. It reminds us that even in a world that is divided, people can come together, if only for a moment, to honor the amazing potential of the human spirit.